Donnelly beating Kaminsky for Nassau County District Attorney, Clavin beating Abeloff in Hempstead, Suffolk County District Attorney Tierney beating Sini. You also had Democrats in control of the Suffolk County Legislature. They not only lost that, but Republicans gained a supermajority, 11-7 majority. And in so doing, they defeated the Democratic presiding officer of the Suffolk County Legislature, as well as the majority leader. That's a wave. That's a lot. That's a lot of power being taken up by the Democratic Party. I'm sorry, the Republican Party, rather. So the Huntington Township, Suffolk County results don't fit the definition of a wave, however, and I propose a different analogy, and it's that of a blue slumber. Democrats did not show up in numbers, and we're going to look at comparing numbers to 2017. What you're looking at there on the map is in the center is Huntington Township, one of the divisions of Suffolk County. So let's take a look at Huntington. In the county legislature, you kind of get a mixed outcome. Susan Berland, who is the majority leader, she loses. She's an incumbent. Mark Cuthbertson is running for an open seat, Democrat, he loses. Tom Donnelly, however, he wins. So it's not as though Democrats didn't show up at all, or it'll be a little more complex when we look a little ahead. And then in Huntington town government, Republicans win it all. They take over the supervisor seat, they take a town board lead of 3-1, and they take over highways. And as you see here from the names, Sannon loses the supervisor role. That was open. Chad Lupinacci was leaving that seat, and so Rebecca Sannon was running against Ed Smith, so it was open. O'Reilly, however, he was an incumbent, and he lost. And then you had two county board candidates, or I'm sorry, town board candidates, who ran and lost in open seat contests. So, by all appearances in Huntington, this was a red wave. If so, we should find that, and I put here, that Republican voter turnout grew compared with equivalent elections. So let's take a look at that. What you have here is a comparison of 2017 to 2021 in the supervisor race. You have Chad Lupinacci beating Tracy Edwards in 2017. This is an important race in Huntington. The town had been run by a Democratic supervisor for a number of years, and he retired, and Chad Lupinacci ran. And it was a notable election from those, when you heard people talk about it, because of the strength of that win. And if you heard people talk about the election, Chad Lupinacci won that race because he wore the soles off his shoes, walking a lot. It was really good retail politics. And ran against Tracy Edwards. She is now the regional director of the NAACP. And people noted that the margin in this race was significant. If we look at that margin, it's a 9% margin. So let's consider that a strong win for the Republicans. If we go to 2021, well, it's even stronger, right? It's a 13% win by Republicans. Ed Smith against Rebecca Sannon. What's interesting is that fewer Republican votes are included here. There are fewer votes for Smith than there are for Lupinacci, even though the margin is much greater, which suggests Democrats weren't showing up. So from 17 to 21, Republicans show a 7.5% decline in votes. There's no surge there. From 17 to 21, Democrats show a 6.8 decline in votes. So they weren't showing up either. So the question is, did Democrats just not show up? And so this is what complicates things a little bit. Errol Toulon ran for sheriff, competed more successfully in Huntington than did other Huntington Democratic candidates for office. So Toulon, Democrat, got 21,900 votes, compared with Sannon, for supervisor, who only got 19,000. So people are voting for Democrats in this area. It's not as though it was this, like, the Republicans just swamped the Democratic Party. Also on the conservative line, Toulon earned a total of 26,000, with the conservative line added, 26,821 votes in Huntington, which is actually more than Smith got in his win for supervisor. So a Democrat succeeded here pretty soundly. And the last observation is just kind of, I'll pass that one up. So what does this information suggest? Democrats were more competitive than the red wave narrative suggests. Two Democrats did win, Errol Toulon and Tom Donnelly for the Suffolk County Legislature. But what's notable is that both of them had the Conservative Party line. Who didn't have the Conservative Party line was Sini, who ran for a district attorney. And that's the right office, isn't it? District? Yes, Sini. He didn't get the line, and so he lost. And a lot of folks say that that was a surprising outcome in the election. And some who know the influence of the Conservative Party line would say it wasn't all that surprising. So to drive home the blue slumber narrative, Democrats far outnumber Republicans in Huntington. And we were just talking about this before we began. The enrollments are interesting. Since 2018, Democratic enrollment edge on Republicans has grown in Huntington from 5,000 to 9,000 plus voters. So you see below there, Huntington 21 registration goes from, or comparison is 54,000 for Democrats, 44,000 for Republicans. And the growth is interesting. Democrats increased by almost 9% in growth from 2018 in terms of their enrollments, and the GOP only goes up by half a point. And I think what needs to be analyzed here is the effects of fusion voting. And if you're not familiar with what that is that a candidate running for office in New York can hold multiple party lines. They could be endorsed or designated by multiple parties at the same time. Well, there was a law that came into, that was passed several years ago, recently, that changed those laws, that made it more difficult for lines to stay on the ballot. So there are a number of lines here that if I backed up, you see some missing lines. If you look at the Lupinacci-Edwards race, Tracy Edwards was on the Democratic, Green, Working Families, Independence, and Women's Equality Party. If you look at Shannon across the sheet, she had the Democratic and Working Families line. So that law influenced the number of parties. People were bounced out of their parties and they might have had to find new homes. Where did Republicans go? Where did Democrats go? It might help account for the movement that we see there on the bottom of the slide. So, relative to registered voters, Democratic turnout declined significantly from 2017 to 2021. In 2017, 41% of Democratic voters showed up in Huntington. In 2021, 35% of Democrats showed up. So these are my key observations here. One, Democrats significantly outnumber Republicans in Huntington. Democrats with conservative party lines were competitive. Democratic vote dropped off as voters moved down ballot, which is an expected phenomenon. And some Republicans appear to have abstained from voting for Amato in the Toulon race for sheriff, delivering stronger numbers to Smith down ballot. So people were moving around. It's not as though Republicans only voted for Republicans and Democrats only voted for Democrats. Suffolk County and Long Island is pretty well known for its shift. It's pointed out that Suffolk County went for Obama and then also went for Trump. And then when Trump overwhelmingly won, Schumer won. So people split their ballots here, which is important and helps explain some of this. And though Smith won in the supervisor race in Huntington, he earned 1,100 fewer votes than Lupinacci earned 4 years earlier. And that does not suggest a red voter wave. So my conclusion is that it's hard to conclude that an overwhelming surge of Republican voters affected the outcome of the 2021 election in Huntington. And the results suggest reevaluating that narrative of the 21 election, at least in Huntington. Was it Republican energy or Democratic apathy? I believe it was Democratic apathy. the Republicans didn't come out in bigger numbers that changed the direction of the town. I want to note, though, I'm not analyzing other areas with this, so you can't extrapolate from this that this is what happened in nearby counties or in nearby townships. But it is, I think, helpful, given the perspective we're given by the media, that kind of helps characterize what happened across the entire country, to take a look at like the molecular level and see what actually happened numerically. And I think this gives us a more complex perspective. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Perotti. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dalton. I am really excited at the selection of that term, blue slumber, because, and I have to thank my friends who are experts in rhetoric, because I think that's a particularly apt term to use. In as much as I've found some of the same things. I will talk just a little bit about what happened in Long Island, but then discuss some more general principles that political scientists look at. All of this doesn't bear repeating because Phil mentioned it. But in Nassau, where Democratic and Republican registrations are 40 Democrat to 30%, we saw the results that Phil showed us. In Suffolk, where Democratic and Republican registrations are about even at 34 and 31%, we saw the capture of the DA's race by the Republican Ray Tierney trounced Democrat Tim Sini. On the sheriff race, Errol Toulon won only because of the votes that he won on the Conservative Party line, meaning that the votes he won on the Conservative Party line exceeded his margin of victory, which I think is important and stood out to me too. The legislative races we talked about, and in my own town, Babylon, Democrats won council seats only because they had also run on the Conservative and for one of them also on the Republican line. Again, they won by smaller margins than they actually got on those other lines. I think that turnout is the reason for this. The turnout of Republicans, the mobilization of Republican voters, and the lack of turnout on the part of Democratic voters. So I really agree. And by the way, we did not coordinate. We just sort of went our different ways and figured, what will we do? So I think what happened is higher percentages of Republican voters came out than Democratic voters. And remember, this is particularly important in close races and in local races. And local races are the races that happen in off-year elections, meaning odd-numbered year elections. Turnout is really low in these elections. A few votes matter quite a bit. Just to give you an idea, in the 9th legislative district in Suffolk County, which is in Brentwood, the percentage of registered voters who came out to vote was 12.9%. In many of the other legislative districts, the turnout was like between 22, 28%. So that didn't lead to a Republican rout everywhere. There were victories for Democrats, as we heard before, but it led for a considerable number of victories. And for those of you who took Poli-Sci 1, or perhaps who took Poli-Sci 114, this is just, again, I want to give you a sense of how many people come out to vote. What you're looking at is a very common, very often reproduced diagram of voter turnout rates in presidential, that's the purple line, and in House Senate off-year elections. So in 2018, our last House Senate election, turnout was like around 50%. Turnout in 2020, our last presidential election, was about 67% of eligible voters. Now let's look at what happens in the off year, the odd-numbered year. In the Suffolk County DA's race, 28% of voters of registered voters actually came out to vote. I did some tabulations. That's about 289,000 people. In my town of Babylon, in the election for supervisor, turnout was 22%. 22% actually went to that part of the ballot and voted. 31,000 people. In District 9, that means that 4,855 people voted. In that kind of a situation, just a few votes really count. And let me stop here and say, what that means is the very races in which you can have the most impact, most people are not participating in. And I think we'll hear more about this in a moment. So I'm really glad that we were looking closely at Suffolk before, because I found a little bit about Nassau. Democratic activists in Nassau, including legislative leader Kevon Abrahams, argued that many Democrats didn't even know there was an election, and that Democratic candidates didn't motivate Black and Hispanic voters to come out. In fact, they pandered, he said, to conservative and Republican voters. And indeed, overall turnout in Nassau County in 21 was down over 2017. 2017 being the last time there was an election for a county exec. They were down more so among Dems than among Republicans. In 2021, as turnout in the county diminished overall, the rate of turnout among Republican voters increased, even as the number of registered Republicans in Nassau County declined. Turnout declined in some key Democratic strongholds between 2017 and 2021. And this is something that activists could observe. For instance, in Hempstead Village, in Newcastle, in Roosevelt, and in Westbury, all with a significant number of Black and Latino voters who typically vote more Democratic than Republican. Turnout declined by as much as 22% between 2017 and 2021. Republican activists, seeing an opportunity in voters' dissatisfaction with the economy and the Democrats' handling of COVID, and more locally on the bail reform issues, fought aggressively for votes in other traditionally Democratic, heavily white areas, such as North Hempstead and West Hempstead. All this was true despite the fact that there were some come-from-behind wins. For instance, Democratic county legislators Arnie Drucker and Josh Lafazan. Elsewhere in the country, turnout was higher, and that benefited Republicans too. Just take a look at the turnout rates, comparison rates for Virginia. In Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin won the governorship, turnout rose from 47.6% of registered voters in 2017 to 55.2% of registered voters in 2021. This was a level unprecedented in any off-year election since 1997. Democrats accounted for 36% of the electorate, Republicans 34%. Youngkin won the independents by a 9% margin, and he comfortably won the suburbs and the rural areas. Just wanted to take a look at a map here. This is what maps look like in my class. Our students are typically writing about the elections state by state, and you'll see the rural places are much more vast, and they're all red, and they surround very small blue places where Democratic voters and population are concentrated. To me, this is a map of our polarization. So that's a graphic of how that was distributed. What happened in New Jersey? Voter turnout increased only slightly from 2017 to 2021, from 39% to 41%, but the turnout in heavily Republican areas, such as Hunterdon, Cape May County, Monmouth County, and Ocean counties, saw an increase in turnout. And the turnout in the more urban areas, and by the way, this is all written in blue, but it's just blue. It doesn't mean that it's Democratic. It's just illustrating increase and decrease in turnout. Turnout in the more urban Democratic areas of Hudson, Essex, Mercer, Bergen, and Salem counties declined. And this is why yes, certainly Democratic governor wins re-election but by really an unexpectedly small margin. Low turnout in the cities where they had anticipated much more. And again, what does that look like on the map? It's the urban places looking real blue, and those rural counties in the west and in the south of that state looking real red, and turnout in those real red places being higher than in the blue places. So there was turnout. There were also some conversions. Anecdotal evidence, if you read Newsday's accounts of what happened in Nassau County, of Democrats who had voted for Biden turning around and voting for Republican candidates in 2021. In Virginia, somewhere between 5 and 9% of Biden voters cast ballots for Glenn Youngkin, and that's from exit polls. Turnout among Democrats across the country was okay, but rural turnout for Republicans was really off the charts. Youngkin mobilized parental discontent over shutdowns and restrictions due to the pandemic, over CRT, critical race theory, the belief that teaching about the history of racial discrimination in the country is unpatriotic. If it is critical race theory, can you ban it from being taught in schools? An academic theory, not clear. But in any case, these are the things that were important across the country. The economy, racial justice issues, as it was expressed in this argument about critical race theories teaching in schools, related local issues such as bail reform, and of course, election conspiracy theories. The SEAL, some small proportion of voters were mobilized by the fact that they felt that their votes were not counted properly in 2020 and wanted to be heard. So this could bode very badly for the Democrats in 2022. And the reason is something that'll be really familiar to political science students. In off-year elections, that is, in the elections at president's midterms, president's party usually suffers a bit. What we're looking at now is a really typical chart, poli-sci 1, that illustrates the numbers of seats that presidents won on their coattails when they were coming into office. So you see at the top there's Truman, comes into office in 1948, and his party wins 75 seats in the House, 76 in the House. In the Senate, they win an additional 9 seats in the House. But what happens 2 years later? His party loses 28. What happens in 1954 to Eisenhower? His party loses 18. Eisenhower's party loses 47 seats during his second midterm election. Johnson's midterm election in 1966, 47 seats lost for the Dems. 1974, Nixon's party loses 48 seats in the House of Representatives. Carter had midterm losses, and then more recently, if you look at Clinton, in 1994, the midterm of Clinton's first term, his party loses 52 seats in the House. What was happening there? It was all about Clinton's failed effort to get healthcare reform, or largely because of that. George W. Bush in 2006, his second midterm election, party loses 30 votes. What happened there for those of us who lived through it? The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were getting unpopular. Obama's first term, midterm losses, 63 seats lost by the Dems in the House. And again, these are net figures. Trump, too, during his midterm election, the Republican Party lost a number of seats in the House of Representatives. So this is a normal thing that happens. And this is the reason why the frame for journalists is doom and gloom, because in fact, the theory is doom and gloom. And it makes us wonder, why does that happen? There are a couple of main reasons, and our political scientists and students will recognize this. One of them is presidential popularity. This is a really familiar chart to students of American politics. If you take your microscope, you can see the names of the presidents at the bottom, from Truman all the way up there to Biden. At the beginning of the president's term, president's in a honeymoon period, his popularity is very high. And inevitably, over the next couple of years, president's popularity is going to decline. It's just a worse situation for some presidents than for others. Certain things that prompt this for some presidents rather than for others. If you look at George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, they start really high and their numbers decline precipitously. For Trump, more of a steady, sort of middling figure there of 30, 40% of support. But for Biden, like most presidents, Biden starts high. His popularity's been up at 50%, and then it declines by the double digits. So one reason for these losses is presidents invariably will become less popular as their honeymoon is over. Another thing that happens is that the economy becomes a factor. If the economy is not doing well, that's one of the main factors that figures into voters' calculations in midterm elections. So this is a trend line of a measure. The Gallup polling organization regularly tracks Americans' ratings of national economic conditions as excellent, good, fair, poor, whether the economy is getting better or getting worse. The combined responses are used to create the Gallup Economic Confidence Index, which has a theoretical range of plus 100 to minus 100. But if you look back at April, it's up there at 40, at February of 20, it's up at a positive 40, and then it declines. People's assessments of various aspects of the economy have declined until October of 21. It's down there at something like negative 25. So if this is what's happening, and this is what's going to pull seats away from the president's party. Things are worst in some particular states, 8 states that are expected to have very close Senate elections, the ones that I've flashed up here on my slide: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Another thing to remember is that redistricting is happening this year, and it will affect the 2022 elections. Not all the states are finished with their maps, but most of the states are controlled by Republicans, and Republicans will, in those states, do what line drawers do, which is they'll try to draw districts that favor their party, just as the Democrats just did in New York. But really, how does this bode for 2022? Is it a foregone conclusion that the Dems will take a shellacking in 2022 also? Well, you could ask yourself, and I don't have a good slide to illustrate this, but you could ask yourself, well, let's look at the polls. But polling is no longer an accurate gauge of what's going to happen in a campaign. We almost have to look at good old shoe leather as well as polling now. For instance, in Nassau, Democrats' internal polls showed that Laura Curran had a 20% lead over Blakeman. They failed to assess who is going to turn out. They failed to predict the likely voters. In the New Jersey governor's race, Governor Murphy was predicted to win a comfortable 8% lead. In a state where Biden won by 16 points, he won with less than 3% of the vote, that is to say, Governor Murphy. Still, he was the first Democratic governor to be reelected in some 44 years. But why are the polls wrong? Well, we're trying to figure that out. The reigning theory is that the reigning theory about what's happening right now is that Republican voters are less likely than Democratic voters to respond to polls, to actually opt into polls, and that is to say, to respond to questions. And they're less likely to believe in the media and in polling institutions as a whole. So unless the polls in the future are weighted to correct for this error, we're going to see the trend of inaccurate polls continue. But there are bad signs for the Democrats. Biden's standing has diminished. The proportion who strongly disapprove of how the country is going is in the 40s. Of those who approve of how the country is going is in the 20s. Those who disapprove of the president are more likely to turn out and vote, as usual. And the base, we might argue, has been demoralized, and I think we're going to hear more about this in a moment. Young voters and black voters who voted for Biden in 2020 are disillusioned. Build Back Better has been blocked. Especially damaging was the failure to move ahead on the climate portion of the bill. Voting rights reforms have been blocked. Afghanistan was hugely cumbersome, tragic, and damaging to the president. The pandemic, inflation, supply chain issues fed by extreme partisanship in the right-wing media, all of these things are going to affect what happens. There's a partisan gap. This helps explain some of the reason why turnout amongst Republicans was higher. There's a partisan gap in perceptions of the economy. The economist Paul Krugman calls this America's feel-bad boom, and he reminds us that Republicans assess the current economy worse than the economy was in June 1980, when unemployment was twice as high. The inflation rate was 14%. Fox News has devoted almost 3 times as much time to inflation as CNN has over the past 2 years, and it's illustrated in its reports with photos of empty shelves that happen to have been taken in other countries, but still. But some Democratic analysts are optimistic, and I want to focus on that. E.J. Dionne, a Washington Post columnist, has written about all of the successes of the Biden administration. And I want to add, before going into that the Republicans now have to own the positions that they won in 2021. And this may actually be, perversely, a good thing for progressives. Governor Glenn Youngkin has launched a tip line to report educators for teaching divisive subjects. He's signed an order banning critical race theory. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has backed a proposed Florida bill that would ban school lessons that make white students feel uncomfortable. That bill would bar private companies from training or employment practices that make an individual feel uncomfortable. Both of these measures reveal Youngkin and DeSantis as extreme. They'll have to continue to defend banning free speech on account of a feeling, pulling books off of shelves. Over the long term, these measures will be difficult to defend among suburban voters, and it'll become more and more difficult to attract and retain teachers, I would predict. In recent columns, E.J. Dionne writes that Biden's accomplishments are being overlooked. For instance, that unemployment has decreased to 3.9. He says that more than 6 million jobs have been created. Wages are rising despite the rise in inflation. There was an infrastructure deal. There was a rescue bill and a child tax credit and a decline in child poverty as a result. That vaccination has been widespread. Nearly 210 Americans are fully vaccinated. All of these things, he says, are positives that the Democrats have not capitalized on in their messaging. What they should be talking about, he says, are popular programs such as subsidized childcare, expanded and universal PK, paid family leave. What they should be doing is pulling out climate and creating separate legislation. Joe Manchin, for instance, has suggested that he might back some climate provisions, stripping away from the Build Back Better provisions on childcare, healthcare, and tax changes. Vast swaths of the electorate support tax credits for energy-efficient heating and cooling, solar panels, electric vehicles, and other low-emissions technologies. Pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act might garner some Republican support and might be able to be pulled out and negotiated. And of course, there is reforming the counting process, that is, passing the Electoral Count Act. This would make it legal for state legislatures, make it illegal for state legislatures or governors to overturn the selection of popularly elected electors chosen in accordance with state law. This has bipartisan support from Independent Senator Angus King, Democrat Amy Klobuchar, and Republicans Susan Collins and Mitt Romney. It also has the support of Republican leader Mitch McConnell, which actually might be a kiss of death. The talks have expanded to include what to do in case of competing slates of voters, handling threats against election workers and officials, imposing penalties for election interference, voting rights and practices, and renewing the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and providing new grants for election entities and for the presidential transition. All of that is quite hopeful, I think. In addition, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act might garner some support on another go-round. Manchin and Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski have expressed support for this. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, you probably know, would require many categories of changes in state or local election procedures to go through the process of pre-clearance, something that was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. Essentially, approval from the Justice Department Civil Rights Division before being implemented. This would deal with redistricting, voter ID requirements, alterations of that sort. Biden can place the spotlight on the Republicans' embrace of conspiracy theories and lack of positive action. He was on the right track January 6th when he urged citizens to ask, what are they, that is to say Republicans, for? On that day, he confessed that he had not anticipated the ferocity of Republicans' opposition to the Democrats' agenda on voting rights. He need look no further than last Friday's RNC censure of Representatives Lynn Cheney and Adam Kinzinger as evidence that the Dems are fighting against a tenacious alternative reality. Former President Trump is necessary for the Republican Party because he's the figure most capable of turning people out to vote. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosanna and Phil. Okay, and for the bazillionth time, if you're a student in my Ret 1 class, please sign in to the form in the back. And if you're not, please disregard that announcement. All right, so I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I have no numbers. I have no images. I have just the force of myself here. So I'm going to start with the question, was it a red wave? I have no idea. So here's the deal. The phrase is hyperbole, as Professor Dalton showed, and that makes sense, right? Newspapers want to generate readership. Nobody's reading papers anymore, so they want people to read them, so they will generate a buzz around an off-year election, as will other political blogs and things to get people to actually find some kind of drama in, again, an off-year election. But as we're debating this question, and this is not intended as a poke at my friend and colleague, Phil, who really took the lead on organizing this, I kind of resent that I live in a country where I have to talk about either a red wave or a blue slumber. The two-party system is just a mess in the U.S., and I kind of think the whole thing stinks. But I also think that it is very clear that something is going on politically. Some kind of realignment is underway. People are frustrated, and in my opinion, both parties are to blame. And in my opinion, I hope I'm wrong, if things don't change, we are headed for something really dangerous, something authoritarian, and I don't think it's going to look like Trump. I think it's going to look like somebody who's actually competent and able to implement an authoritarian agenda. So in what remains of my time, I'm going to share my thoughts and observations, and in so doing, toggle back and forth between local, state, and federal politics. And then I look forward to hearing your responses. So I'm going to start locally, and you heard this from my two colleagues, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but to repeat what they said, but let's talk a little bit about Nassau County. What happened locally in my district, in my county, Nassau County? And I paid attention more so than I might usually do, one, because I vote all the time, and two, I'm going to let you in on a little secret that a couple people in this room already know. Had Todd Kaminsky won, I thought about throwing my hat in the ring, and my potential campaign manager is actually in this room. So this election was really interesting to me, and Todd Kaminsky was supposed to be a shoo-in. All right, he ran for DA. He was first, he worked as a federal prosecutor. He's a native son, Long Beach, and that's where I live. So he worked as a prosecutor, then he was elected to the Assembly, and then he was elected to the Senate in a special election, and then he ran for DA, and he was considered, a rising star and unstoppable. His uncle is also Mel Brooks. I mean, he's got all kinds of free PR. He also had a lot of money. He had the incumbency, he was already in office, right? He had the advantages of being in office, though not in the office for which he was running. He had money, he had name recognition, and he had local connections. So why did he lose? Well, as we talked about, it was an off election. Most people aren't interested. It's hard to get people interested. The turnout wasn't very large. But the conventional wisdom is that Todd lost because of his support for the bail reform law. He voted for it in the budget bill, and that vote got weaponized by Republicans. And the word was, if it works in New York, in the DA election in Nassau County, they'll use it in other places. Laura Curran, who ran for re-election as Nassau County executive, also lost to the Republican Bruce Blakeman. She lost by a narrower margin. It actually was kind of down to the wire. People weren't quite sure what was going to happen. She has claimed that it's because of Kaminsky that she lost, that his failing candidacy tanked her own possibilities. Also, she lost because property taxes. Okay, property taxes in Nassau County, this might be not so relevant to those of you who don't own houses, but if you are the child of somebody in Nassau County, I'm speaking to the students here, obviously, though maybe to the adults too, of somebody who owns a house, you will know that the property taxes are astronomical. And that was another thing that was tagged onto Laura Curran. She had done some work with equalizing, and we have this really horrific system where you can contest your taxes, and she wanted to stabilize that. But that pinned on her also. Even though property taxes have been frozen during the pandemic, I pay over $1,000 a month in property taxes, okay? And they have just continued to go up. So Bruce Blakeman promises to lower people's property taxes. They pay attention because that's a lot of money. So what can we take away from this besides just the brute facts on the ground? Will Nassau County revert back to being red or to trending red, and why does this matter? So here are some of the popular arguments about why suburbia goes red. There's lots of talk about racist Republicans and racist suburban voters in general, and racist voters in general. And I live in the world, I think there's some truth there. Okay, suburbia, Long Island, is super segregated. Racist voters exist. But not all people who don't vote Democrat are racist. That's a fiction. It's a convenient fiction for Democrats, particularly Democratic operatives. It provides easy cover for them and for the people who don't want to do the work of actually delivering for constituents and then convincing voters that they have delivered for constituents. It's also a bummer, because if voters are irredeemably racist, then nothing is going to change, and we may as well all hang our hats up and go home. And I refuse to believe that. So what do I believe? What do I think? I'm a rhetorician in addition to being the director of labor studies. So I think, as a rhetorician, that part of the problem we're dealing with here is messaging, framing. Republicans are often better at defining the issues, defining them the way they want to define them. Nonetheless, they're better at it. Bail reform. Bail reform is not a green light for criminals who have done really horrific things to walk the street, right? But it's been framed that way, and the Democrats allowed that to happen. They were not first out of the gate in framing the law. Now, judges can still require bail for people accused of violent felonies, sex-related charges, and some domestic abuse offenses. What is changed by bail reform is that it allows people accused of misdemeanors to not lose their jobs, fail to pay rent, or have their children taken away while they await trial. You could frame that stuff innocent until proven guilty in a really compelling way. They just don't do it. Given how it's been framed, I'm thinking maybe the Dems will have to take a hit on bail reform for the next few years in, super close races until the law's been around for a while and people see that it isn't actually responsible for violent felons running amok. Another problem, and Professor Perotti alluded to this, although she and I have, I think, different takes on much of it, is that we are deep into another round of the culture wars. And I think, frankly, that a lot of what's happening in the culture wars is a distraction from real issues. Example, who cares about Joe Rogan? I mean, seriously, whether Joe Rogan's podcast continues on Spotify or not is irrelevant, I think, or should be, first of all, because I'm a free speech absolutist. But second of all, really? People are concerned that Joe Rogan had a negative impact on people's health in the U.S.? We are one of the few, if not the only, advanced economic nation in the world that does not have universal health care. The problem is not friggin' Joe Rogan. The problem is we need access to health care for every human being in the United States. Joe Rogan is not the problem. And we're not going to get universal health care statewide. In New York, under the Dems currently, nor are Californians going to get health care in their state under the Dems, because after lobbying by pharmaceutical and insurance companies, the Dems decided to pull back on health care. We're also not going to get health care nationally, even though there is a Democratic majority in Congress and a Democratic president. Now, there is a bill to keep employers from pulling health care from striking workers. I don't know if most of you are aware, but we are in the middle of a strike wave. October was called Striketober. Thanksgiving was called Strikesgiving, all right? And we are in the middle of what I hope will be a resurgence of the labor movement. But strikes are actually threatened when striking workers fear that they will lose their health care. So labor militancy is quashed by the lack of universal health care. So although there's the Striking Workers Health Care Protection Act being proposed by Democrats, come on. We shouldn't need this bill because you shouldn't lose your health care ever. You shouldn't need a job to have health care. But there are a lot of other things we're not going to get either from the Democrats. We're not going to get a $15 minimum wage. It's now nationally $7.25 an hour. Ready? $7.25 an hour. We're not going to get taxpayer-funded community college tuition, though we were told we would. We're not going to get student loan forgiveness. We're not going to get the PRO Act, the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which would make it easier for workers like Starbucks baristas to form a union. We're not going to get an extension of the child care tax credit that Professor Perotti mentioned. Or are we going to get, maybe we will, but I'm thinking we won't, unless there's a lot of public pressure, a law banning members of Congress from trading stocks. Despite a Democratic majority, slim though it may be in Congress, we're not getting any of this. Now, putting the blame on Manchin and Sinema has been very convenient for the Democrats, but that only goes so far. You know who's opposed to the law banning stock trading for Congress people? Nancy Pelosi. Okay? Now, there's talk that she might be pulling back on that, okay? But she hasn't committed yet. Nancy Pelosi. All right, not a Republican. In fact, Josh Hawley is pushing for a law to do that, which Nancy Pelosi says, since we live in a free market economy, we shouldn't do, which is to ban members of Congress from trading stocks. According to Common Dreams, members of Congress and their family members in 2021, while many people were losing their jobs and their health care and their livelihoods, traded $355 million in shares of prominent corporations on the stock market. 55 members of Congress didn't even report their financial trades as required by the flimsy Stock Act that we have on the books right now. So putting the blame again on Manchin and Sinema only goes so far. We're not getting a whole lot of things. We might, however, get a war with Ukraine that, ironically, Tucker Carlson is speaking against. Now, to be fair, we are getting some good stuff. We got new fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks. We rejoined the Paris Accord. We have increased availability of COVID testing. We have project labor agreements. That means mandatory or contracted union agreements on construction projects that get $35 million or more in federal funding. We have a better National Labor Relations Board. The counsel for the NLRB, Jennifer Abruzzo, is doing her best to protect workers' rights to organize. And for the students, that might seem a little far off, but trust me, when you get out of here and get a job, that will matter to you. Or if you have a job now, it should matter to you. And this may make all the difference in the next round of Amazon organizing at Bessemer, Staten Island, and everywhere else. But how do you make these kinds of things salient and interesting to voters on a large scale? I don't know about you. I'm the director of labor studies, and it's hard for me to get really, to get excited about how sexy it is that we have a good counsel for the NLRB. All right, rhetorically, this stuff is a bit of a hard sell. I mean, it's not like people are opposed to it, but it's not like you go to bed saying, yes, we love the counsel for the NLRB. And even the pro-labor stuff is incomplete. Let's take Wisconsin, right, where we see there's going to be a tough race for the Senate. By the way, I love the guy. Do you Fetterman, who's running? Anybody in here from Pennsylvania? You have like the coolest guy running for Senate. He's covered with, he's awesome. He looks like some guy you would see at the gym and say, oh my gosh, I'm terrified. And he's all about marijuana legalization. It's like Jersey has it. I can't believe we don't. So So there's some interesting stuff happening, but there's some not so good stuff happening, even when we have, again, pro-labor initiatives. So let's look at Wisconsin. The new multi-billion-dollar contract, right? There's a new multi-billion-dollar contract to build an electric fleet for the United States Postal Service. And this was given to Oshkosh Defense. Oshkosh Defense now decided to move the 1,000 jobs, right? So the 1,000 jobs making this multi-billion-dollar electric fleet for the Postal Service from Wisconsin to South Carolina. Bonus points for anybody who can tell me why they might move from Wisconsin to South Carolina. Anybody? You have to take labor studies. Because the United Auto Workers has organized the workers in Wisconsin, and they don't have to worry about a union in South Carolina. Okay? So Wisconsin's political leaders and labor unions are stepping up pressure on Oshkosh Defense, as well as the Postal Service and the White House, to get the company to keep that manufacturing in Wisconsin. The 10-year contract, which could exceed $10 billion, is expected to create more, in fact, than these 1,000 jobs. And the people who are working to keep those jobs in Wisconsin say, look, unless these jobs stay in Wisconsin, the Democrats are screwed in November and in 2024. So we hear all this talk about how do we keep rural voters? How do we keep voters, Democrats in the Rust Belt from abandoning the party? This is how. If the Democratic record remains this mixed and their messaging this moribund, vote blue is not going to resonate next time around. I want to stop for a minute and say a little bit about CRT, all right? Because there's a lot of debate going on about critical race theory, all right? And education in general. And there's real parental frustration out there about education, as Professor Perotti mentioned. And that frustration is not all about CRT. And it's not all just white parents who are frustrated. Okay? COVID-related school closures were really problematic for lots of parents. Okay? Regarding the 2022 gubernatorial, and regarding the recent gubernatorial race in Virginia, election experts asserted that the closing of schools because of COVID and the switch to virtual learning weighed heavier in the Democratic defeat than critical race theory. People saying things like, my kid isn't learning anything, and that was bothering them. Mask mandates for children, also frustrating to parents of all kinds. Even snow days. A recent article in Time magazine described how a parent was frustrated, the author of the article actually, because he noticed that affluent children in private schools were getting online Zoom instruction during snow days, but public school kids weren't. And when he said something about it, he was told to be quiet. All right, this kind of stuff bugs everybody, okay? And it's not about critical race theory. Another problem with education that hurts the Democrats, efforts to address the very real discrimination against Black and Latino students with regard to admissions into elite schools and or gifted programs that results in the disenfranchisement of Asian and South Asian students. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? There are problems that Black and Latino students are underrepresented, and when they try to rectify that, they propose and implement solutions that then disadvantage Asian and South Asian students. That is a big part of what happened in Loudoun County, Virginia. If any of you are familiar with the work of Matt Taibbi, Rolling Stones journalist, now an independent journalist, he spent a lot of time in Loudoun County, did a 4-part series on it, and one of the things he found was that South Asian parents felt like nobody was listening to their concerns, particularly the Democrats, and many of them were historically Democratic voters, about the changes to the admissions program for some of these gifted programs that disadvantaged their children. Same thing happened in New York. Only 9% of offers made by elite schools like Stuyvesant High School and Bronx High School of Science went to Black and Latino students, down from 11% in 2020, right? That's a problem. Over half of the offers actually were going to Asian students. In 2021, over half of the offers went to Asian students, many of whom were low income, and many of those low income students were immigrants or the children of immigrants. So what do you do if you're a Democrat, right? I don't think this is there's an easy solution to this problem, but I think it's a problem that Democrats aren't doing enough to acknowledge. How do you talk about this, let alone address it? What rhetorical frames are available to talk about race and immigration and education that do not ignore the nuances of race and the significance of class, and do not force a black-white or black-brown-white binary on a situation in which it may not always fit? And what about critical race theory, to go back to that subject? Frankly, I think much of the Democratic messaging and messaging by progressives on this stinks. Critical race theory isn't being taught, people are told. Well, okay. But when diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants are being hired and paid hefty sums, I think it was $500,000 in Loudoun County, Virginia, where the Republican trounced the Democrat who was supposed to win, when they're being paid hefty sums funded by property taxes, and when those consultants make recommendations that are guided by interpretations of critical race theory, then that argument that critical race theory doesn't have a place in schools rings hollow. People call bullshit, and rightly so. Okay? Why not own, if you're a Democratic candidate, that critical race theory really doesn't belong in schools? It is not teaching history, all right? That's not true. I mean, I studied critical race theory as a graduate student. It really doesn't belong in primary, middle, or high school education. Don't say it isn't there, say it doesn't belong. And if it's there, we'll get rid of it, right? But own also that teaching history, actual history, messy history, the displacement of indigenous people, slavery, Jim Crow, immigration, xenophobia, class conflict, as well as the labor movement, the indigenous rights movement, the women's rights movement, civil rights, immigrant rights, etc., all belongs in the curriculum. Make it impossible for Republicans to disagree without sounding like terrible, horrible human beings. Not terrible, horrible human beings to Upper West Side liberals or ordinary or academics, but terrible, horrible human beings to ordinary people. Look, I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat. I'm a socialist, surprise, surprise. I feel no compulsion to defend either party, all right? And I think both parties deserve scorn and approbation. So back to the question, was the most recent election a red wave? Well, to me, it feels more like a wave of frustration. Look, the current Republican Party is a lost cause. I admit that. But unless they get their act together, so are the Democrats. To me, there's something worse about the party that presents itself as the party of the good guys, the party of the morally superior, the party of working people, which, by the way, historically the Democratic Party was, all right, at least from FDR until Clinton, all right, and doing so little to improve the material conditions of people's lives. I think if this keeps up, the next wave that hits us might not be a red wave, but a red tsunami, or quite possibly something worse. Thanks.
We're going to take your questions from up there, and that's where we go now. So I think if you have them, raise your hand, voice.
Do you have a question, or are you the, oh, okay, you're the person making sure the stuff works. Thank you for your work, by the way. Don't all rush to the microphone.
Yeah, don't injure each other. Nothing thought-provoking.
Well, maybe you have a comment, if not a question.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. I don't usually do this. I'm kind of like a shy person when it comes to coming up to these type of things. But I disagreed with a lot what you were saying, Professor Mary. I just felt like there are things that you can blame on Democrats, and I'm saying this as someone who's also an independent when it comes down to it. But there's other things that I feel like shouldn't be placed blame on Democrats and shouldn't be causing this wave. Yes, kids have to wear masks in school, but even in private schools, and as we see a private university, we all wear masks. And I don't see anyone's parents showing up trying to fight it, or anyone here trying to fight or go against it. There's also the fact that, like, yes, there's no more snow days, but as someone who went to private school, there was also no more snow days in private school. They would either do it online or give us off days. And I've seen public schools, someone like who still have siblings in public school, when things are going on with COVID and stuff like that in school, they still will give kids education and will help them by giving them iPads, computers, to make sure and ensure they get the same quality of education that a private student would get.
So first, I want to commend you, because I know if you're a shy person, it's not easy to get up and stand at a microphone. So I think that's terrific. Thank you for doing that. Second, these are concerns that people have who aren't, I don't have school children, so they're not concerns that I have, but they are concerns that actually a lot of people have. And I appreciate that they might not be concerns that you have or people you know, just like they're not concerns that I have. But I don't think that that makes them not concerns. I mean, there are a considerable number of people who are, and also school closings hit some of the most vulnerable people the hardest. If you can't afford childcare because school is your childcare, and there's no one to watch your children if there's no school, that makes it really hard. That's not a problem, again, that I have, and it might not be a problem that you have. And if I represented it as a problem that I have, then I erred, but it is a problem that and a concern that a lot of people have voiced.
I just want to mention that, like, specifically, I feel like the problem has to do with, like, more Republican states, because I know at least here, if you can't afford childcare, my mom owns daycares, this is the reason why I know, they give you vouchers which pay for the childcare by the city. And this is something that I know are done in many Democratic states, so that even if kids can't go to school because of concerns such as this or other concerns, their parents can still send them to daycare and be able to go to work in peace.
That's not entirely true. We don't have federally funded childcare, and we don't even have adequately state-funded childcare in New York. There are systems in place to help. Typically, also, they help the least able to pay, but then there are lots of people stuck in the middle. That's the problem with non-universal programs, right? Once you have a cutoff point, then people who are just over that cutoff point do not benefit from the program. So I wish that assistance for childcare was much more widespread. I wish that we had universal childcare, but even in democratic states, it's not quite as widespread as it would really need to be to be helpful to most working people. But you're right; those programs do exist, but I don't think that they're sufficient to meet the need. And the U.S. is one of the few industrial or post-industrial countries that don't have a system in place to meet the need.
So then, to you, do you think that what many Democratic states are missing is that we don't have these universal systems? Because I know universal pre-K is a thing,
Right.
and I know it exists in daycares. It's part of the daycare center, and I know that these are given for free to people
Right.
that need them, even though those who fall in the in-between spots. And I feel like your children is young enough where, like, they can't even go to pre-K. It's more like it's been an issue always to send them, because where else are you supposed to place them when they're working? Which is why I feel like
Right.
it's an issue even if you are working and, like, can't put them into school, because at that point you should be able to either get them a voucher for universal pre-K, or you've always had this issue with daycare because they're not too old, like they're not old enough to go to school.
Yeah, I think the thing we're also not mentioning here is a parental leave, too, right? I mean, we are, again, one of the few places, the few advanced economies that don't offer significant parental leave, too, because that would take some of the burden off of the need for childcare if we actually had programs in place that allowed parents, when they had really small children, to spend time with them. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the things you mentioned are real. There are programs that really exist, not nearly enough to fill the need. And they should be, I think, at the federal level, in addition to whatever programs. And that's one of the big achievements of, one of the, I would say, few big achievements of the de Blasio administration in New York. And I'm not a big de Blasio fan, but he deserves credit for that, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually.
Yeah.
There's also the point I wanted to make about how I feel like a lot of blame does go on to Joe Manchin because of the simple fact that it is almost a split, but when you have like a 50-50 split and there's two people from your party saying, no, we don't agree with this, how is it supposed to go through? And it was the same deal with the Build Back Better plan. I believe he was one of the only people who said no to the deal.
Can I jump in there?
Mm-hmm.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, I'm the political scientist on the panel, so one of the things that it preoccupies me is the rules, the institutions, the way they're set up, and how they set us up to either win, lose, or stalemate, or cooperate or not. And having this two-party system has made it really difficult for people, for instance, who from the far left or or to the right in that party who disagree, to be able to have a voice. And we see it in the elections. I think a lot of the people who would agree with what Professor Trasciatti just said didn't vote because they're frustrated that nothing has been happening for them. And that's probably why you saw a lot of a depressed turnout amongst young folks and African Americans in 21 over 17. I'm a political scientist. This is a theoretical thing. It'd be very difficult to adopt a different method of voting and a different kind of party system in the United States. But we're forced into these kind of discussions by our two-party system. We're forced into arguing whether Joe Manchin is allowed to, to oppose what his party is doing. And that's unfortunate, but it is because of our institutions, which perhaps need to be re-examined too.
Just to respond to that, I completely agree with you. I feel like we should adopt other countries' systems where they have more than two political parties that are represented. They usually have about 3 to 4, so that people have a more divided and are able to share their opinion without fearing that they won't be able to vote. Because I know people who do represent as independent aren't allowed to vote, I believe, in these elections. Like, they can't vote because
in
they're
primaries.
Yeah, in the primaries.
Yeah.
So it's like something that I feel like truly does affect when we look at the voting polls and we look at how voters are trying to vote, because when most people that don't agree with either aren't allowed to vote, it makes it very difficult to be like, oh yeah, this is what's going on in our system.
And it's not just, let's have more parties. If you want to have more parties, you have to change the rules to create incentives for people to want to create more parties and then to stick with them. And that means some form of a proportional representation, which we saw in the city. We saw ranked choice voting this time. It was very interesting, first time. But that's a huge change. And a huge thing for, kind of thing for people to accept. So I don't, it's difficult for me to envision that becoming super popular anywhere but in local races like New York City anytime soon.
I think you're completely right about that. It's just our country is too divided to be able to say, oh yeah, let's create new parties or let's create a new system, because everyone will automatically disagree. There's something that I learned in my class the other day. It's like the zero-sum game, which is like you take power from one party, you like gain one piece, the other party loses one piece, you each get zero-sum gain. And I think that's what a lot has to do here, because these parties imagine if we start a new party, if we divide our power, then we're no longer the most powerful people in this country. We're now going to be second hand, and we have to fall and get along with these other parties for us to make any kind of decision, which is like, I think, the issue here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's, if we could have another question or comment, please. Thank you.
Hey folks, how's it going? I'm curious how much you think COVID affected the turnout numbers for either party in the previous election, and if you think that either successful dealing with COVID moving forward towards the sort of off year that isn't the off year will affect those turnout standings, or if you think that it'll matter anyway, like perhaps there won't be another variant and perhaps things will see another sense of closer to normalcy, if you think that will change the sort of projections that we're seeing.
I just think that COVID affected the way that Democrats sought to mobilize people to come out to vote. And I saw that personally in 2020 in our congressional elections. Democrats were not going to door, but Republicans were. And door to door is way more effective than calling somebody for a lot of different reasons. And that, I think, happened again in 21. So there was an imbalance in the strategy of reaching out to voters. That's just one way that I might mention.
I'd like to add that if looking at the local elections where I live, and I've seen some writing about this nationwide, COVID has energized people in their school districts, particularly on the right. And so opponents to masking and other directives has them coming to school boards. If you look at Smithtown out in Suffolk County, there's a very active crew of people organized who show up, and they're strongly encouraging and helping organize in other school districts, people to show up and argue against masks and other mandates. I drive to school every morning, and there's a house near where my son goes to school where there's sometimes a newly made, handmade anti-masking sign that is up. People are very much energized by this. You don't see pro-mask signs up. So I think that played a role. For an off-year election, that people were energized about that issue at the school district level, I think that definitely favored the right.
Also, Ryan, article in the New York Times, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, showed that on both sides, actually, people are like over it increasingly. And the Dems are showing signs that they're like worried that being too mask, close is going to hurt them in the next election. So I think that primarily on the right thing is starting to shift. COVID fatigue is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Right,
Thanks.
yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. I just have a question. I know that you mentioned Stuyvesant High School and the High School of Bronx Science. And me being a Latina from the Bronx, I took the specialized test for those high schools. And I know personally, like, it was very hard. And I know that I didn't get in because I didn't score good in that test. So I just wanted to know how you would personally just increase the numbers of minorities getting into those high schools since it's based off a specialized test.
Yeah, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, the problem is that Asian students have done extraordinarily well. That was also in Loudoun County, right? The test to get into these gifted programs, Asians were extraordinarily South Asians in Loudoun County, overrepresented. And when they said, okay, we're going to take the tests away and come up with other metrics, because one way to look at that is, okay, then, the number of Asians drops radically, and who takes those spaces then? Is it white kids or is it Black and Latino kids? My education policy isn't my strong point, so I don't know what the solution is to that. But I do know that what got Democrats in trouble in Loudoun County was that they did not offer a sympathetic ear to the very real concerns of South Asian immigrant parents who said, look, I moved here because I wanted my kid to get into this program. Or Asian immigrants in New York who said, I want my kid to go to Stuyvesant, I worked hard. And I don't know, that's the problem, right, is I don't know how, but I do know that a simple black-white binary it leaves them out completely. And what you do, because Latino students and Black students are underrepresented, right? They're not there. But what they found in New York is, at least with regard to Black students, increasing the numbers of students who take the test did not lead to an increase in it actually, they went down. I don't know. And I'd feel more guilty about that if my area was education. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff out there that send me an email and I'll send you some links to people I know who do research and write about this and have some really compelling suggestions. But I don't know, it's a problem.
Honestly speaking, from going to public school in the Bronx basically my whole entire life, they do lack a lot of resources when it comes to preparing you for that test.
Right.
I know personally, like, I can't remember going to an extra class or a program where my teachers taught me the specific content that was on that test. So the people who do excel on those tests have to do their own studying. So there's a lot of lack in the resources and materials that they do give to every kid in public schools, not just the minorities.
Thank you.
It's an issue, yeah.
Thank you. We have more people behind you.
First, I would like to thank all three of you for your time. My question revolves around how people should go about voting when they are not loyal to the party in which they're voting for. I'm someone who's been liberal for most of my life, and I find it increasingly difficult to submit my ticket for Democrats over and over again after seeing multiple failures. I know I'm not the only one on this side of the aisle as well who believes this. There are also many conservatives and people who are of conservative belief who are increasingly frustrated with the Republican Party as well. What can these people do today to affect the way that they can vote and actions that they can do where they are loyal to the ideology of these principles but not to the parties?
Well, I'm a firm believer that there's really no better way to affect the system than to be involved in a party and to energize that party and do the shoe leather work of the party in concert with other people who think like you. If you do the sorts of things where you engage your neighbors, talk about issues, you suddenly speak with a collective voice, and people have to deal with you. So I'm not unlike yourself. I don't think it's a secret. I'm a Democrat, and I felt the same way about things. But I felt I can't just unplug. I need to just go join the party. So I joined the party, and then you realize it'd probably make you more disappointed. And what you need to do is do the work of fixing it, whether it's left, right, center, wherever you are on the spectrum. If you leave it to other people, it's only going to be as good as they are. So if you are more energized, more driven than they are, step into it and try to fix it.
I will add, Yusuf, that for a long-term plan, we're trying to work on advocacy for different kinds of rules, like proportional representation. And I could give you links to websites, organizations that are doing just that long-term. Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
I just wanted to thank you guys for your time, and I wanted to ask, what are your opinions on whether or not CRT should be taught in schools, and why or why not?
I already said my piece, I'm gonna let you guys go.
Well, I agreed with a lot of what Marianne said, Dr. Trasciatti said. There's nothing about the history of race and indigenous people and all sorts of civil rights movements that should not be taught in our schools. It's a messy, it's an awful history at times. What I always find, what I really love about our country, and this came to mind to me as a college student when I went to the Vietnam Memorial, is you realize the nation put a black scar on its own campus to reflect on what it did and the deaths that it caused. And it's an amazing nation that will reflect openly about its mistakes. And I think that's awesome. I think that's fantastic about the nation's capital. We should do that in our schools. My understanding of critical race theory, and like Dr. Trasciatti, I studied it too as a graduate student, is that it's not what I just described. It's trying to account for differences. It's often described as symbolic Marxism. It's not about material, but it's trying to understand where people are in society and then looking around at society for how it happened that way symbolically. And in doing so, I think we miss a lot of the material issues that are really, really very important. In fact, it might invite us to miss many of the material issues. And by that, I mean class and money.
I was going to say this thing about Marxism. Marxism, I don't think, should be taught to little kids because they couldn't understand it. But it's about deep structures of power. And it should be taught in universities and law schools, and it is, and CRT should also. But I completely agree that we must be interested in seeing our history in its entirety. It really helps to see when you broaden the lens of so much new scholarship is showing us other things that were going on outside the more narrow history that I may have learned. That's only to the good. So I would support exactly what Phil has said. For kids, not the abstract theory, but an accurate gauging of history.
Okay, thank you.
Why don't we take these two next questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi. So I had kind of both a question and a comment, and I'm also kind of shy, so excuse me if I stumble over my words. I thought that obviously all three of your presentations were incredibly interesting, and I wanted to point out, just in my experience as the viewer, that you two seem like the kind of political science experts, and I know that you were saying that you were the labor studies and rhetoric expert, and I found that both of your presentations were very educational, and they had all the numbers, and I think were very compelling to the people in this room that are interested in politics. And then I also thought it was interesting that your speech was extremely, it evoked more emotion, I think. I think that it had, if you were to have it written down and look at it, I would disagree with a lot of what you said. And I think we could talk about it, forever. We could have, discussions about every little detail of what you said, but ultimately the speech itself was more, kind of draws you in more, because you clearly have mastered rhetoric and you understand it very well. And I guess my comment is just that it's really interesting that that affects how we intake media so much, the news, and just how a lot of us do get our media from social networks, and that what we tend to look at is it is what is most compelling. It is this really strong rhetoric coming from both sides. And my question is, do you think it's possible for us to move away from this political environment we've created where both sides are throwing as much rhetoric and extreme language and kind of extreme views, this polarization that we've created, if it is possible for us to have a political environment without that? I know that it's probably impossible for it to be non-existent in, any sort of, being in politics is a competition. There's no way to compete with people without it involving some rhetoric and stuff like that. But it's gotten so extreme, and I'm wondering if you guys believe that there is a way for us to move away from that.
Yes, and one thing I'm just going to say is that I think the period that we have come out of, the period from post-World War II until recently, is the aberration in U.S. history. This notion that we have an objective press, this notion that there is a kind of enlightened, kind of above it all media, is really a product of the forced consensus of the Cold War. For most of U.S. history, our media was explicitly partisan and explicitly ideological. And you go back and even look at the New York Times, look at any newspaper, right, from the 30s, the 20s, even into the 40s. This was much more of the norm, that people took ideological positions, and people understood that, right? Then we had the Cold War and the Red Scare and the Cold War, and we kind of marginalized a left perspective, and liberals participated in this as well, right? I mean, they pretty much legitimated the Red Scare and the Cold War, so we kind of marginalized a left perspective. And when you marginalize one side of the continuum, everything shifts to the other side. So we have this kind of forced Cold War consensus at the same time that we had a kind of shift to the right. And I think what we're seeing right now, and I don't think enough people talk about the influence of the Cold War on U.S. society and how we're kind of realigning after the collapse of the Cold War. And now we're sort of struggling to try to figure, that's why I said we're in a moment of realignment, right? But I think that period where there's such a thing as objective media is really not the norm, meaning normal, but the exception. And now we're just sort of figuring out kind of a new order of things. And things might remain quite polarized for a while. But I don't think either side of the continuum is actually responding to people's material needs very well at all.
If I could just jump in just with a real quick comment. I think this place, this place here in a university and with us, that is the place where reasoned discussion has to happen, and we have to model it for everybody else. I think we have forgotten some of that, and it kind of makes me wake up every morning and want to go and do my thing, to know that it's the right thing.
Yeah. So that, just like off of that, as you know, a lot of us are into political science if we're in this room. A lot of my friends are not political science majors. They're, you know, like film and TV, psychology, that sort of stuff, a lot of STEM majors. And I know that people that aren't studying political science or philosophy or any major that causes, that, you know, emphasizes kind of critical thinking, those people do tend to be attracted by the strong headlines, right? The kind of aggressive headlines, and that concerns me personally, at least. That is how all of us are intaking our understanding of what's going on in the world around us and how we're forming our opinions. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about if you think we'll be able to move away from that. I definitely think education's important, but I don't think everybody's getting it.
I didn't have an answer for you, because I don't know the answer. But there is a speaker next week, Thomas Howell, who will be speaking about populism and the appearance of it and the increasing popularity of it. And I think he may be addressing questions along those lines. How do we walk back what we've opened up in terms of what's happening in our public discussion? So you might be interested in that. I don't have the date offhand, but look for that.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you. One last question, and thank you for being patient.
I appreciate hearing all the different perspectives today, and it definitely was very interesting to me, and especially like, you know, you bringing up all the headlines, and really appreciate hearing your different perspective with your speech. I wanted to know, and you've mentioned like a couple times, Professor Perotti especially, like, you know, this is the place where we have the discussions and we model it for other people. I was just interested if you have any plans to make sure people are watching. Because I'm pretty sure this ends up on the Hofstra YouTube page, and the people that know to go look through there or have the opportunity to see this talk. But this perspective that all you guys are bringing up, that the media is misrepresenting something that's pretty important, that conversations are being had with information that isn't all the way correct, you know, what are we doing to get that to the people higher up the chain, you know? Whether it's people in the Democratic Party, whether it's people in the Republican Party, whether it's people in the media, you know?
It's a really tough question, because to me, the problem is that each of us, the responsibility of each of us is to educate ourselves, is to try to understand what others are thinking, and to get the facts straight, to have a reasonable view of, to try to attain a reasonable view of reality. And that's the most important thing, and it's an individual responsibility, but there's no way to police that, it seems to me. Except through really loud voices, which we don't really have in the academy.
Mm-hmm. I don't really know how to answer that. One thing that comes to mind, and it is that the Center for Civic Engagement tries to hold these deliberative dialogues, very much a thrust of it. And its goal is to have people in a room talk with each other, but more importantly, hear each other, which maybe for some people in some cases is the first time on some political issues they've ever heard another person's perspective. And so does that address the larger question? I don't know about that, but it does. We do things to invite discussion, to encourage discussion and listening, so that we can be more civil. Yeah.
You know, it used to be that the struggle was to get a podium, and now, you know, an audience, right, to speak, and now the struggle is to get people's attention. And that's partly why discourse is so inflammatory now, because everybody is vying to get people's attention. And I don't know how you break through that. You know, I don't tweet, I observe on Twitter, and it's unbelievable. The kind of stuff that gets engagement. And we have monetized that to where our primary platforms for presenting information and arguments monetize negative engagement. And we underfund public media, right? We don't have alternative, truly publicly funded media. We underfund just about everything that needs public funding to be robust. And so absent that, I really don't know how we get stuff out there, because the most provocative voices, the ones that most inspire you to want to like beat somebody with a stick, are the ones that get the most engagement.
You know, I'm reminded of the film Don't Look Up. I hope that if you haven't seen it already, I hope you will see it, because it reminds us that the most terrible thing could be happening. You know, an asteroid going to hit the planet, or maybe global warming going to cause all kinds of damage. And what are people talking about? They're talking, you know, about the things that we talk about in really inflammatory ways. And again, I come back to it's an individual responsibility that somehow we have to realize rests with us and with us alone.
Thank you.
Hope that helped. Thank you all very much for coming out. It was a pleasure. And if you're interested in a civic engagement minor, there are brochures in the back. I invite you all to take one until they're all gone. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. That was.
Sure.
Are you
Thank
up?
you.